August 1261. While every baker in the town of Bury St Edmunds was purchasing their yeast from the abbey brew house at the price the monks set and the schedule the monks kept, one baker in the village of Horringer, 2 miles outside the town walls, was cultivating something in a clay crock behind his oven that the abbey's grain steward would have confiscated on sight. Thomas, a free tenant who had operated a small bakehouse on his own land for 11 years, had spent the previous 3 summers developing a method for maintaining a live yeast culture independently of the abbey's supply. His neighbors called it foolish. The abbey's baker, who heard about it through the grain market, called it a violation of the monopoly that the abbot held over fermentation and milling in the district. The reeve who collected the abbey's fees told Thomas directly that what he was doing was illegal under the terms of the manor's banalités, and that he should stop before someone with more authority than a reeve came to tell him the same thing. Thomas kept the crock behind the oven and said nothing further about it to the reeve. His bread kept for 8 days without hardening. The standard loaf baked with abbey yeast went stale in 2. Nobody in Horringer could explain the difference, but everyone who bought from Thomas had noticed it, and by the summer of 1261 his customers had stopped buying from the abbey's authorized baker in the village and were coming to Thomas instead. What did this baker understand about fermentation, wild yeast cultures, and the chemistry of bread that the abbey's trained bakers had not developed in 200 years of production? If you want to hear accounts of practical knowledge that worked before anyone understood why it worked, stay with this one. The town of Bury St Edmunds in 1261 was one of the most administratively controlled market towns in England. The Benedictine Abbey of St Edmund dominated the town's economic life in a way that was unusual even by the standards of monastic authority in medieval England. The abbot held the right to control milling, brewing, and baking across a substantial area of Suffolk, and this control was enforced through a system of fees, inspections, and penalties that had been in place since the Norman conquest and had been contested unsuccessfully by the town's residents several times in the intervening 2 centuries. The banalités system, as it operated in the Bury district, required that grain be ground at the abbey's mills, that yeast for baking be purchased from the abbey's brewhouse, and that the resulting bread be baked within regulated standards of weight and composition that the abbey's officers inspected at the market. Bakers who violated these terms faced fines, confiscation of equipment, and in persistent cases, the loss of their right to trade. Thomas held land in Horringer as a free tenant rather than a villain, which meant his legal position was somewhat more protected than that of bound peasants on the abbey's domain. He paid his fees, he used the abbey's mill, and he sold his bread at the market weight and composition that the inspectors checked. On these points, he was careful and consistent. The yeast was a separate matter, one that he had chosen not to discuss with the abbey's officers, because the question of whether free tenants were required to purchase fermentation agents from the abbey was genuinely ambiguous in the existing documents, and ambiguity was something Thomas had learned to use. His father had been a baker in the same location and had operated under the same constraints. His father's bread had lasted 2 days. Thomas had watched this for 20 years before he decided to do something about it. The problem with abbey yeast was not that it failed to leaven bread. It leavened bread reliably and consistently, which was precisely why the abbey sold it. The monks who managed the brewhouse maintained cultures that produced predictable results. Bread that rose to a consistent height, had a recognizable flavor, and met the weight standards that the market inspectors applied. From the abbey's perspective, the system worked. From a baker's perspective, it worked within a narrow definition of working. The yeast the abbey sold was a single-strain culture maintained in brewing conditions optimized for ale production. It leavened bread, but it contributed nothing beyond leavening. The bread it produced was standard, predictable, and stale within 2 days under normal summer conditions. Thomas had noticed something during his years of baking that he could not explain in any theoretical terms, but that he had observed consistently enough to treat as reliable. In late summer, when wild fruit was fermenting on the trees and the air in the orchard behind his bakehouse carried a particular quality that he associated with warm fermentation weather, his bread lasted longer. Not dramatically longer, perhaps half a day more than usual. But the difference was there, and he had noticed it. He had also noticed that on the days when he used the last of a batch of abbey yeast that had been sitting in its container for several days rather than freshly purchased, the bread tasted different, sharper, and it lasted slightly longer before hardening. These were 2 observations with no theoretical connection available to him. He did not know anything about microbiology. He did not know that yeast was a living organism, or that multiple species of yeast and bacteria could coexist in a culture, or that the bacterial component of a fermentation culture contributed acids that affected the structure of bread in ways that yeast alone did not. What he knew was that certain conditions produced bread that kept longer, and that these conditions had something to do with the fermentation agent used. He began experimenting in the summer of 1258, 3 years before the confrontation with the reeve. His first attempt was simple and failed. He left a portion of abbey yeast in a covered crock with a small amount of flour and water, hoping to extend its activity beyond the few days it normally remained viable. The culture died within a week, overtaken by competing organisms that produced off flavors and no useful leavening. He started again. His second attempt incorporated something he had observed in the orchard. He left the crock open for several hours on a warm afternoon in late August, near the fermenting plums that were dropping from the tree at the edge of his property. He then covered it and fed it flour and water daily for a week. The result was a culture that had a sharper smell than abbey yeast, that produced visible bubbling activity without added warmth, and that leavened a test loaf with a flavor noticeably different from the standard product. He baked a loaf with this culture and set it on the shelf beside a loaf baked with abbey yeast, purchased the same day. After 2 days, the abbey yeast loaf had hardened to the consistency that made it difficult to eat without soaking in liquid first. The culture loaf had softened slightly on the surface but remained edible without soaking. After 4 days, the abbey yeast loaf was inedible. The culture loaf was stale, but could still be consumed. He fed the culture again and kept it going. Over the following summer, 1259, he refined the process through observation. He learned that the culture needed to be fed on a regular schedule, approximately every 2 days, with a portion discarded before new flour and water were added. He learned that temperature affected its activity significantly, that a culture kept too far from the oven's warmth in winter became sluggish and produced unreliable results, and that one kept too close to direct heat died. He learned that the particular flour he used for feeding mattered, that the coarser, whole-grain flour he ground himself maintained a more active culture than the fine flour he purchased through the abbey's mill. By the summer of 1260, he had a culture that had been alive and continuously maintained for over a year. He used it exclusively for his baking and stopped purchasing abbey yeast. This was the decision that created the legal problem. The abbey's grain steward, a monk named Brother Gilbert, who was responsible for the brewhouse accounts, noticed the decline in Thomas's yeast purchases in the autumn of 1260. The decline was not gradual, the kind that might indicate a reduction in baking volume. It was complete. Thomas had simply stopped buying. Brother Gilbert sent a message through the reeve asking Thomas to explain the discrepancy. Thomas replied that he had developed his own leavening method and was no longer requiring external yeast. The reeve, when he relayed this response to Brother Gilbert, also conveyed his own assessment, which was that Thomas was operating outside the terms of the agreement that bound bakers in the district to the abbey's supply. The legal question was, as Thomas had calculated, genuinely unclear. The abbey's documented rights covered milling and brewing. The specific question of whether the production of a fermentation culture for personal baking use constituted brewing under the terms of the existing grants was something that would have required a formal legal proceeding to resolve. The abbey's officers were not eager to bring such a proceeding against a free tenant whose bread was popular in the local market and who paid his other fees without complaint. A proceeding that went against the abbey would set a precedent that they preferred not to establish. The reeve delivered his warning in person in the spring of 1261, standing in Thomas's bakehouse, looking at the clay crock behind the oven, and telling Thomas clearly that he was taking a risk that might not end well. Thomas thanked him for the information, offered him a loaf of the bread in question, and said he would give the matter thought. The reeve took the loaf. He did not file a formal report with Brother Gilbert for another 4 months. The bread that Thomas's customers were buying in the summer of 1261 was different from standard market bread in several ways that they could observe directly even without understanding the cause. The crust was thicker and more irregular than the smooth surface of abbey yeast bread. The interior had a slightly more open, uneven structure with air pockets of varying sizes, rather than the uniform fine crumb of standard bread. The flavor had a mild sharpness that some customers described as sour, and others described simply as different. And it lasted. In August heat, when standard bread went stale in a day and a half, Thomas's bread remained edible for 6 days. The practical value of this was not abstract. A household that purchased bread once a week rather than 3 or 4 times a week spent less time at the market, carried fewer loads, and wasted less food to staleness. For families where the wife or daughters made the market trips while the men worked in the fields, the reduction in required journeys during the August harvest period was genuinely significant. Several of Thomas's regular customers told him directly that they bought from him because they did not have to come back as often. The baker, authorized by the abbey in Horringer, a man named Richard, who rented his bakehouse from the abbey and was legally bound to use abbey yeast, had been losing customers to Thomas steadily since early spring. Richard's complaints to the abbey's officers were what had prompted Brother Gilbert's inquiry in the first place. Richard's position was straightforward. He was following the rules, his competitor was not, and the competitor was taking his trade. This was a legitimate grievance by the standards of the system in which both men operated. Richard had no technical response available to him. He could not match Thomas's product because he was required to use the yeast the abbey supplied, and the abbey's yeast produced a different and, in this specific quality, inferior result. His only recourse was to the enforcement mechanism, which was what he pursued. Brother Gilbert arrived in Horringer in September 1261 with the reeve and a written statement of the abbey's position on the matter. The statement argued that Thomas's culture constituted a brewing operation and therefore fell under the abbey's monopoly rights, that he had been producing it without authorization for at least a year, and that the appropriate remedy was confiscation of the culture and a fine calculated on the basis of the yeast purchases he had avoided during that period. Thomas's response was prepared. He had consulted with a clerk in Bury who was familiar with the abbey's grant documents, and he had identified the specific language that described the abbey's brewing rights. That language referred to the production of ale and the maintenance of brewing vessels for commercial purposes. Thomas argued that his clay crock was not a brewing vessel, that his culture produced no ale, and that the preparation of a fermentation agent for use in his own baking on his own land was a domestic activity that fell outside the terms of the commercial monopoly. Brother Gilbert did not accept this argument. He also did not immediately confiscate the crock. The legal ambiguity that Thomas had identified was real enough that the monk was unwilling to act without clear authority, and obtaining that authority would require a formal proceeding that the abbey's senior officers had not yet authorized. The matter was referred upward. Thomas continued baking. The formal resolution, when it came 4 months later in January 1262, was a compromise that satisfied neither party fully, but that both accepted. Thomas was required to pay a fee to the abbey for the right to maintain a personal fermentation culture for baking purposes, the fee set at a level significantly below what he would have paid for equivalent yeast purchases over the same period. The abbey established the principle that such cultures required authorization. Thomas established the principle that authorization was available to free tenants who applied for it. 3 other bakers in the district applied for the same authorization within 6 months. The chemistry of what Thomas had developed in his clay crock was not understood in his lifetime. What he had cultivated was a sourdough starter, a culture containing both wild yeast strains and lactic acid bacteria that coexist in a stable relationship when maintained with regular flour and water feedings. The wild yeast provided leavening, as commercial yeast did. The lactic acid bacteria produced acetic and lactic acids that the abbey's single-strain brewing yeast did not. These acids affected bread in several ways. They lowered the pH of the dough, which slowed the activity of the enzymes that break down the starch structure of flour after baking. It is this enzymatic activity, called staling, that makes bread go hard. Standard bread stales because its starch structure breaks down and reorganizes into a crystalline form that is rigid and dry. The acid environment of sourdough bread slows this process significantly, not by preventing stalling entirely, but by delaying it long enough that the practical difference in shelf life is substantial. The acids also affected the gluten network in the dough differently from commercial yeast fermentation. Longer fermentation times which sourdough cultures typically require, allowed more complete development of gluten structure, producing a bread with better texture and a crust that remained crisp longer after baking. The irregular crumb structure that Thomas's customers noticed, the uneven air pockets, was a result of this different gluten development rather than a defect in the baking process. The specific bacterial species most commonly found in stable sourdough cultures are lactobacillus strains, several of which also produce natural antimicrobial compounds as metabolic byproducts. These compounds further slow the growth of the molds and bacteria that cause spoilage in baked bread, contributing to the extended shelf life independently of the staling process. A well-maintained sourdough loaf resists not only the physical process of staling, but also the biological process of spoilage. Thomas had not isolated any of these mechanisms. He had observed outcomes and adjusted his process to produce better outcomes. This is the same method that underlies all practical knowledge developed outside formal scientific frameworks. The mechanism does not need to be understood for the outcome to be used. The 4 months between Brother Gilbert's visit and the formal resolution in January 1262 were productive for Thomas in a way that the abbey's officers had not anticipated. The dispute had become known in Horringer and in the surrounding villages through the ordinary movement of information in a rural market community. People who bought bread at the weekly market discussed the quality of what they purchased, and the discussion of Thomas's bread and the abbey's attempt to stop him producing it had the effect of making his product more interesting to potential customers rather than less. Margaret, who ran a household in the neighboring village of Fornham and came to the Horringer market when her own village's supply was short, heard about the dispute from the woman she stood beside at the grain stall. She bought a loaf from Thomas that week to see what the matter was about. She brought it home on a Thursday. On the following Tuesday, 6 days later, she cut the last of it for her household's evening meal and noted in a conversation with her husband that it had outlasted any market bread she had purchased in recent memory. She returned to the Horringer market the following week and bought 2 loaves. This pattern of purchase, driven entirely by the practical observation of quality rather than by any instruction or recommendation from authority, was what sustained Thomas's trade through the period of legal uncertainty. He was not advertising. He was not making claims about his product that his customers could not verify themselves. The bread demonstrated its own qualities on the shelf over the course of a week, and the demonstration was sufficient. Richard, the abbey authorized baker in Horringer, lost 6 more regular customers during the 4 months of the dispute. His formal complaints to the abbey's officers became more urgent, which was part of what accelerated the resolution. The abbey had an interest in settling the matter before Richard's trade was further reduced, since Richard paid rent for his bakehouse, and his ability to pay that rent depended on maintaining customers. The formal authorization that Thomas received in January 1262 was a document of 3 sentences on a strip of parchment, recording that he had paid a fee for the right to maintain a fermentation culture for personal baking use on his land in Horringer. It did not describe the culture, its composition, or the method used to maintain it. It did not represent any endorsement of his method or any acknowledgment by the abbey that his product was superior to what they supplied. It was an administrative resolution of an economic dispute, written in the language of property rights and fee payments. Thomas kept the document. He also kept the culture. Over the following years, he answered questions from other bakers who had heard about his bread and wanted to understand how it was made. His explanations were practical and specific. Start the culture in late summer near fermenting fruit. Feed it every 2 days with coarse flour and water. Keep it warm but not hot. Discard a portion before feeding to prevent the container from overflowing, and allow the dough to ferment longer than standard bread before baking. He could not explain why this worked. He could describe what he did and what resulted from it. 2 bakers in neighboring villages developed their own cultures, using his instructions within 2 years of the authorization. A third tried and failed because he used the wrong flour and did not maintain the feeding schedule consistently enough to keep the culture stable. He came back to Thomas and asked more detailed questions about the feeding process, received more specific guidance about timing and consistency, and succeeded on the second attempt. This is the form in which the knowledge spread, not through any written document, not through any formal teaching structure, not through the abbey's instruction or any other institution's endorsement. Through conversation between people who needed practical results and were willing to share what produced them. The abbey's authorized baker, Richard, did not adopt the sourdough method. His legal agreement with the abbey required him to use abbey yeast, and that requirement was not modified by Thomas's authorization, which applied specifically to free tenants operating their own bakehouses on their own land. Richard continued producing standard bread until he gave up his tenancy in 1268 and moved to another part of Suffolk. His successor in the rented bakehouse eventually applied for an authorization similar to Thomas's and received it on the same fee terms. The abbey's brewhouse continued selling yeast to the majority of bakers in the district through the remainder of the 13th century. The sourdough method that Thomas had developed spread through the informal network of small independent bakers who had the legal standing to apply for the authorization and the practical inclination to invest the time that maintaining a live culture required. By 1300, roughly a dozen bakers in the Bury district were using the method. The abbey's yeast sales declined proportionally. There is no document recording that the abbey attempted another enforcement action against the practice after the 1262 resolution. The precedent set by Thomas's authorization had established the principle clearly enough that further challenges would have had to confront the same legal ambiguity, and the abbey's officers appear to have decided that the fee income from authorizations was a more practical response than continued enforcement attempts. This was the economic logic that Thomas had understood from the beginning of his experiment. He had not set out to challenge the abbey's authority or to make a point about monopoly rights or the freedom of craftsmen. He had set out to make bread that lasted longer, because bread that lasted longer was worth more to the people who bought it, and therefore to the person who baked it. The legal dispute was a consequence of the practical success, not the objective. The household economics of bread quality in a medieval English village in the second half of the 13th century are worth examining because they explain why shelf life mattered as much as Thomas's customers demonstrated it did. A typical household in the Horringer area in 1261 purchased or produced bread as its primary caloric staple. Grain, milled into flour and baked into bread, provided the majority of the calories that working families consumed. The frequency with which bread needed to be purchased or baked was determined by how quickly it became inedible, and the cost of staleness was not just the cost of the bread itself, but the cost of the time spent obtaining a replacement. For a household whose working adults spent the August harvest weeks in the fields from early morning until failing light, the reduction in market trips that Thomas's bread allowed represented real recovered time. A loaf that lasted 6 days instead of 2 meant 3 fewer trips to the market over a fortnight, each trip involving travel time, waiting time, and the carrying of purchases back to the household. For a woman managing children, animals, and a kitchen garden simultaneously with the demands of harvest season, this was not a trivial difference. The waste reduction was also significant. Standard bread that went stale before it could be eaten represented wasted grain, wasted mill fees, wasted baking fuel, and wasted purchase cost. A household that threw away a quarter of each loaf to staleness and then paid for replacement bread was spending more than a household that used the full loaf. Thomas's customers were not paying more for his bread than for Richard's. They were paying the same and getting more of it into their households intact. These are the practical calculations that determined purchasing behavior at the Horringer market in 1261, and that drove Thomas's trade during the period of legal dispute. His customers were not making an ideological choice between independent craft and institutional supply. They were comparing the value of what each baker offered and making the rational decision. Thomas died in 1279, 18 years after the confrontation with the reeve. The parish register of Horringer records his death without detail beyond the date. His bakehouse passed to his eldest son, also named Thomas, who continued operating it, using the same methods his father had developed. The younger Thomas maintained the culture his father had started in 1258, feeding it and using it without interruption until his own death in 1304. The culture itself, if it had been maintained without interruption from 1258 to 1304, would have been 46 years old at the younger Thomas's death. Whether it continued beyond that point in his household or in the hands of another baker in the district is not recorded. The practical knowledge of how to start a new culture from the environment was not lost when any particular culture ended. The method could be restarted by any baker who understood the process, and by 1300 there were enough bakers in the district using the method that the knowledge was embedded in the community's practice rather than held by a single person or family. The Abbey of St. Edmund continued to operate its brew house and to sell yeast to bakers who either preferred its convenience, were legally bound to use it, or had not heard about the alternative. The authorization fees it collected from sourdough bakers were a small fraction of its total income from baking and milling rights. The institutional record of the dispute is contained in the Abbey's account rolls, which record Thomas's annual authorization fee from 12 onward as a line item among dozens of other small fees, without any indication that the Abbey's officers considered it significant. The bread that Thomas baked in Horringer in the summer of 1261 and the bread produced by a skilled sourdough baker today are not identical, because the specific wild yeast and bacterial strains present in any culture depend on the local environment, the flour used, and the history of the culture's maintenance. But the principles are the same coexistence of wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria, the same extended fermentation, the same acids that slow staling and resist spoilage, and the same observable result of bread that keeps significantly longer than bread produced with commercial single-strain yeast. The formal understanding of why sourdough bread behaves differently from commercial yeast bread developed across the 19th and 20th centuries as microbiology advanced to the point where the organisms in a sourdough culture could be identified and their metabolic products measured. Louis Pasteur's work in the 1850s on fermentation established that yeast was a living organism and that its activity was biological rather than chemical, the way that earlier theories had described. The identification of the bacterial component of sourdough cultures and the role of lactic acid in bread quality came later through the work of food scientists working in the 20th century. Thomas had none of this framework. He had 3 summers of observation, a clay crock, a coarse flour feeding schedule, and the legal tenacity to defend what he had developed against an institution with considerably more formal authority than he possessed. He did not know what was living in his crock. He knew what it produced, and he knew that what it produced was worth the effort of maintaining it. The abbey's single-strain yeast, managed by trained monks in optimized brewing conditions, produced reliable standard bread. Thomas's maintained wild culture, started next to a plum tree in late August and fed with flour he ground himself, produced bread that outlasted the abbey's product by 4 days on a summer shelf. The institutional system produced consistency. The individual observation produced something better than consistent. In January of 1262, the abbey charged Thomas a fee to continue doing what he was already doing. He paid it, he went home and fed his culture. He baked his bread. His customers came back at the end of the week instead of the beginning, and the difference was the point. The parchment authorization from January 1262 survived in the abbey's account records at Bury St Edmunds until the dissolution of the monastery under Henry VIII in 1539, when the abbey's documents were dispersed. A portion of the account rolls from the late 13th century passed into the collection of a Suffolk antiquarian in the 17th century and were eventually deposited in a county archive. The authorization itself, 3 sentences on a strip of parchment, was catalogued in the 19th century as part of a survey of abbey economic records. The cataloger noted it as an example of the abbey's fee structure for small trades and gave it no further attention. It was not until a historian working on medieval baking practices in East Anglia reviewed the same records in the 20th century that the entry was identified as an early documented instance of independent sourdough production outside monastic or large commercial contexts. The historian's paper, published in a journal of food history, described the case in 4 paragraphs and noted that the technical details of Thomas's method, as far as they could be reconstructed from the account record and surrounding documents, were consistent with what is now understood about stable sourdough culture maintenance. Thomas is named in the account record. His method is not described. The fee he paid is recorded to the penny. What the bread tasted like, how his customers described it, what the reeve thought when he ate the loaf Thomas gave him, none of this is in any document. It existed in conversation and in the memory of people who bought bread at the Horringer market on August mornings in 1261, and it passed out of the record entirely within a generation. What remains is the line in the account roll, the fee, and the fact that 3 other bakers filed for the same authorization within 6 months. The demand created by one man's clay crock and 3 summers of observation outlasted everything else about him in the written record. That is, in its way, a precise accounting of what he had actually done.